But in essence, you want some water? Okay, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. Welcome back. We have an all-star panel of extraordinary depth and experience to talk about the other great power that came up in the last session. It's Russia. It's not China. But you'll remember yesterday and again today, both Professor Jonai and I remarking that one of the hallmarks of President Trump's national security policy, and I agree with him on this, at least his administration, is that the greatest threat to the United States right now is the power of China and Russia. It's different. One is clearly ascending, China. One may be descending over the long term, but think about Vladimir Putin. He's the most experienced leader of a major country in the world today. He's 20 years in power. He's highly opportunistic. He still has nuclear weapons. His goal is to cut the United States down to size. We are still dealing with a peer competitor, at least in the transatlantic area in the Middle East, and in strategic terms with Russia. Toomas Ilves, far end of this to my right, to your left, former president of our great ally Estonia, former foreign minister of Estonia, Estonia's first ambassador to the United States after the reassertion of Estonia's independence in 1991, and Toomas and I have worked very closely together for 25, 30 years on all these issues. Victoria Nuland, one of the truly outstanding American career diplomats of the last several decades, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Russia and Ukraine under President Obama, ambassador to NATO, an acknowledged experts on these issues, tough as nails with the Russian Federation, if I can say that, and a close friend. Dr. Kathleen Hicks, Senior Vice President at CSIS in Washington, occupant of the Henry Kissinger Chair, Senior Defense Department official under President Obama. In my view, one of the smartest people in the United States on our national security and on American defense. Very pleased to have her here. And on my right, a Renaissance man, a protean man, former acting director of the CIA, former deputy director of the CIA, former director of intelligence of the CIA, former director of Europe, as I remember, John, of the CIA, when Toria and John and I were working together at the very end of the Cold War as the Soviet Union was crashing and burning. John was leading the analytical effort in the United States government to make sense of this and to make sense of what would happen to an empire that split into 15 states on December 25th, 1991. I should also tell you now, Professor at my alma mater, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a semi-professional magician. So we've got a great panel here today. So I'm going to ask each of them about a different challenge we have with Russia, and then we'll probably go a second round, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions and your comments. But let me just list, I just sat down right here and listed 7 specific threats that Russia poses to the United States. I'll bet we could come up with double or triple that if I gave the panel 5 minutes. Threat number 1, Russia continues to threaten its neighbors, occupying Georgia, occupying Ukraine, harassing Moldova, harassing Belarus, and Toomas will tell us, threat number 2, trying to undermine, seeking to undermine Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, 4 NATO allies. Threat number 3, Kath will talk about it, assault on our democracy. I just listened to the intelligence community on their January 7th, 2017 report. I've read it, and the Mueller report. There's no question Russia not just intervened, they tried to smash our election in a variety of ways. Will they do it again in 2020? Threat number 4, which Toria is going to speak to, Russia is essentially walking out of the treaty that President Reagan and President Gorbachev signed in December 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We've got big questions about whether arms control can continue. Threat number 5, Russia has replaced the United States as the most important power in certainly Syria and certainly Lebanon, and in terms of its relationship with Iran. That is a deficit for the United States. It's not additive. Threat number 6, Putin said at the Osaka summit 2 weeks ago, the G20 summit, he said this liberal order that the previous panel was discussing, he said it's dead. Ronald Reagan's vision of America, dead. John F. Kennedy's vision, dead. And we're not punching back. That's threat number 6. We have no JFK or Reagan arguing that our democratic system, of course, is superior. Threat number 7, he wants to cut us down to size. And as Toria knows, he tries everything he can to do that. We've got a substantial competition underway with Russia. Toomas, President Ilves, let me just ask you, you have lived your entire professional life, and your personal story is remarkable, and you might want to just say how you got to Estonia, from where, and the lessons you've learned. What's it like to live next door to the Russian bear, and can Estonia defend its independence? And can we help you do that?
Okay. Well, just briefly, as you can tell from my accent, my linguistically formative years were in New Jersey. But I'm a child of refugees. I moved here, actually, and unlike some other people, I did go back. But I worked, previous to becoming ambassador, I worked for 10 years at Radio Free Europe.
Yeah.
Now, do we feel afraid? Well, I mean, it's paradoxical that, in fact, I would say the countries you mentioned, the ones who are in NATO and the European Union, are far more relaxed these days, because the things that we have seen Russia do, not only in the United States, but also in Western Europe, we have been living with for 25 years. One of my earliest experiences with President Clinton and the State Department was when Boris Yeltsin told an absolute lie about what we were doing in Estonia. I had to jump hoops. The U.S. Embassy had to jump hoops, and we proved it was all wrong. It was a lie. But you know, we've been facing disinformation from the get-go, even from before independence, when they were trying to discredit the independence movement. So in many ways, we're much more relaxed. I did spend all my time until 2004 to get Estonia into the European Union and to NATO, precisely for the reason that we see now, which is that unlike Ukraine or Moldova or Belarus or Georgia, I mean, attacking us would have genuine consequences, real consequences. Whereas, I mean, it's kind of if we see the tepid response of the West to what they have done, for example, in Ukraine, on the part of Western Europe, then we see, well, thank God we joined when we did. In fact, that was my own paranoia that, well, we have a window of opportunity. We have to get in there into those two organizations as fast as possible. Now, I say the neighbors of Russia that are in the EU and or NATO, I mean, Finland, the 3 Baltic countries, Poland, who else is there? I mean, most of the other countries are kind of buffered, I mean, the membership in those two organizations gives us a form of security, or a sense of security, that at least allows us to breathe and not be worried, because we know that in fact, we do have the NATO umbrella, we have the European Union, Lisbon Treaty, I call it the olive oil Article 42.7, which says that in case of an attack on an EU member, then the other EU members are obligated to help, which in some cases might mean sending us olive oil.
But NATO is a different animal.
But NATO is a different animal. But in any case, I say that, so there is that difference, but it's quite clear, and I would end with this, that basically what we have been experiencing for all of these years, 28 years now, is now beginning to be experienced by Western Europe, I would say, as of 2014, 2015. It is no accident that the NATO Cyber Center is in Estonia, and the NATO Stratcom Center, which actually deals with countering propaganda and disinformation, is in Latvia, because we had the experience with that and enough experience to actually go to NATO saying, we think this is a problem. Whereas, and those were both set up before, we saw the kind of actions that we have seen since Crimea, basically directed towards the West.
Thank you. One of the questions that Tori and I get a lot when we spoke together in Chicago a couple of months ago, we're both former ambassadors to NATO, is why did you expand NATO to the east, up to the Russian border, Estonia? Didn't that drive Putin to be more aggressive? And the answer I think that we both always give is, we freed 100 million people in Eastern Europe to live free lives in places like Estonia, Latvia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. You can be sure the Russians would be back in if we weren't there. And that's my follow-up question to you, Toomas. A year ago this week,
they freed themselves, let's put it that
they
way.
freed themselves, but we secured it.
In that defense, yeah.
That's right. A year ago this week, the president was interviewed by Tucker Carlson the night of his Helsinki summit with President Putin. Tucker Carlson said, why should we send young Americans to fight for NATO ally Montenegro? And the president demurred. He did not say that he would support a NATO ally in an Article 5 attack by Russia specifically. Jens Stoltenberg said yesterday, Toomas, that deterrence rests on the ability of the rival to understand exactly what we're going to do. Do you think that our Article 5 commitment to you in this administration is real?
Well, it's one reason why, even before this administration, actually shortly after I became president, I started pressuring the government to spend 2%, to take that off the table, because you could
2% of GDP on your
2% of GDP on defense. Sorry,
yeah.
It's kind of shorthand for NATO people, but because you could already see then. I mean, Bob Gates said it, and Hillary Clinton wrote it, basically saying, if these countries don't spend 2%, then we're going to lose a taste for NATO, which is why all three, actually the four countries you mentioned, the three Baltic countries and Poland, all spend 2%, at least 2%,
yeah.
On defense, to take at least that issue off the table.
Toria, we are containing Russian power in Eastern Europe, but since 1963, when President Kennedy negotiated the nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev, we've also been trying to limit the type and the number, quality of nuclear weapons to assure stability and to avoid nuclear Armageddon. Do you fear with the INF treaty, President Reagan's treaty limiting intermediate missiles, that's going off the books August 2nd. There's a question whether the Trump administration wants to take up the Russian offer to extend New START, limits on strategic weapons. Do you fear that this era, more than 50 years of arms control, controlling nuclear weapons, is coming to an end? And what kind of dangers are there for all of us?
And add to that Russia also fell out of the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty about 10 years ago.
And you were a negotiator.
We tried to negotiate a way through that, and we failed. Not that we think that the next battle will be reams of tanks. We think it's more likely to be little green men and electricity turned off and that kind of thing. I worry about the way we have handled the Russian violations in the first instances in the Obama administration, and now the decision by us to withdraw because they are violating rather than to try to work our way back through and put counter pressure on them to stay in the treaty. And the reason the Trump administration is willing to let Russia out of the Intermediate Forces Treaty is, and just to remind, this is a treaty from 1987 that banned weapons, medium-range nuclear weapons. We used to both have weapons. Remember the Pershings in Germany, and the Russians had hundreds of their own that could hit our European allies and were a potential point of blackmail, one way or the other. So the treaty from 1987 banned all of these weapons, and they were all removed from the European theater. So we still have the long-range weapons, we still have sea-based and air-based and all of those things, but this particular one disappeared until the Russians started violating the treaty about 5 or 6 years ago. So now we're in a situation where Russia has missiles, once again, nuclear-tipped missiles that it can fire from current sites that can hit Berlin and Paris, not to mention Estonia. The short-range missiles have always been there. And we have not either put a sufficient cost on Russia to have them rethink, nor have we put in place sufficient countermeasures of our own that can serve as a deterrent to stop them from using them. And what I worry about is that President Ilves appropriately feels much more secure now that there are the conventional forces of 5, 10 NATO countries at a time in Estonia, protecting your territory, working with you. But that wouldn't stop a Russia with medium-range nukes from turning out the lights on Estonia, moving in when NATO didn't have enough force, and saying, we're going to keep this piece of territory, and if you don't allow us to, we'll use this little nice nuclear set of weapons we have on Berlin. So the challenge for us is to get conventional deterrence going, and to get that going, and to get it going in a sufficient manner such that the Russians rethink this set of weapons altogether. So you could be talking about medium-range conventional weaponry that can take out the Russian nukes on their launchers. You're talking about missile defenses, these kinds of things. But right now, we're only just starting a conversation about that in NATO. So for several years, the Russians will have this advantage. And now they are petitioning us to extend the reduction in long-range weapons, the New START treaty, that was negotiated under the Obama administration. I personally believe that that is the right thing to do. To extend. And they want to extend it because they can't afford to build new long-range nuclear weapons. But we shouldn't let them have it for nothing. We should use, and we can if we need to, we should use this demand and requirement that they have on the long-range side to get them back into compliance with the INF and with a whole bunch of other issues that we have concerns about that we're going to talk about here, because they should fear that we will outpace them on the long-range side if they're going to play these kinds of games that can potentially threaten our allies and folks that we've pledged to defend.
So that's what you think we should do. What do you think that President Trump will do on the question of New START?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the reason he's willing to get out of the medium-range treaty is because he wants to build medium-range weapons against China. And it was a global treaty that constrained both of us. So we could not easily, but we could have gone to the Russians and said, let's maintain the medium-range treaty vis-a-vis the European theater and work together on the threats coming from China, or at least not worry about China. On the long-range side, I worry that the president doesn't believe in the successes of long-range arms control, that he thinks that it's useful for the United States also perhaps vis-a-vis China to build more long-range weapons, and wants to spend the American taxpayer money that way. So he's perfectly willing to let Russia do the same. And, we'll see.
We can come back to this, and we will, but I have to go back to you. I just have to ask your opinion, because you were a senior official until very recently. If, God forbid, Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland were attacked by any means, electronic warfare, a conventional attack, would this particular American president stand up for them?
Well, I want to believe that there will be big pressure from the American Congress, that there will be big pressure from our allies to fulfill our treaty commitments. We have twice had enormous votes from the Congress in support of NATO. And interestingly, among the American people, support for NATO and support for the UN, by the way, is on the rise, because Americans don't want to go it alone. And they remember that it was NATO who came to our defense after September 11th.
We were together.
But what I worry about is timing. I worry that too much territory will be ceded, too much pressure will be put on these vulnerable allies, and it will then take a lot more to push Russia back by the time we get our act together.
No, I would just interject quick. Actually, I am one more reason why I'm relaxed, at least on military attacks. We'll talk later about other things, but is that in fact the entire Putin regime exists, or I mean, relies upon laundering their money in the West where it is safe. That, I mean, even Putin. And why would you want to start a war or invade Western Europe, I mean, okay, you could deal with us, but then that would put everything on hold and they'd probably have all of their things confiscated. But they don't really want to lose the West. It's much cheaper to threaten us, or it's much cheaper to use disinformation to change governments or get governments you like than it is to invade. And besides, you would lose your money. And the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been laundered out of Russia in the past 25 years, I mean, it would disappear. But they don't want that.
So
just to continue that thought, though, we have to be willing to use these kinds of asymmetric tools. You can't just have nukes for nukes. You have to be willing to say, okay, your access to our banking system is ended if you threaten our allies. So they're, you know.
So you've reassured us. It's the Tony Soprano mafia-like oligarchy of Russia, which is the real defender of Estonia.
Yes.
In that sense. Good. So Kath Hicks is an expert on all these strategic, nuclear, and conventional issues, and she's free to say what she wishes here. But I also wanted you to comment, Kath, on the new Russian threat that we saw materialize in the United States in 2016, the Netherlands, France, and Germany in their elections in 2017, in our midterms. And I'd just like you to talk about what you think is coming down the line. This is the asymmetric threat of cyber and social media.
Sure. So to pick up where Toomas sort of left off, there's a whole suite of ways to undermine U.S. interests, advance Russian interests relative to the U.S. and its Western allies that don't require combat forces. Important to deter any possible thought about using combat forces. That's why we have a stepped-up presence in Eastern Europe and more than that. But the real concern of what we've seen is that they have this suite of tools. There are many of them. One subset of them are around influence and information enabled by cyber. And then one target set within that is elections.
Right.
So I just want to set that context because it's a very important subset, and I'm going to focus on that, but it sits inside a whole bunch of other places the Russians are going. So, of course, we know, as you've already mentioned, the Russians are validated from our intelligence community as interfering in the 2016 election. In 2018 midterms, we have the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, has come out and said very clearly that the Russians were engaged in attempts to influence that election. By the way, also were the Chinese and the Iranians, according to the DNI. Then you fast forward to the EU parliamentary elections that have just happened. There also was a statement from the EU that the Russians were seen to be interfering in a campaign, a sustained campaign, to affect European elections. And only days after that, President Trump was asked at the G20, did he anticipate, would he tell the Russians not to meddle? He was sitting next to near President Putin, and he said, don't meddle, wagging his finger, don't meddle in our elections, but in a tone that conveyed a validity of it was a lighthearted approach. And I think this is the real challenge that we face going into 2020, right? Which is it's now an accepted fact. And in fact, the FBI director has already said that they are engaged in operations aimed at the 2020 election. The president seems to be tacitly acknowledging it, but we're down to meddling and, you know, boys will be boys behavior or something of that sort. And in fact, what we're really seeing is more what the EU has pointed to, a sustained, deliberate attack to undermine the vital interest, the core vital interest of democratic society, and in the United States, the core tenets of our Constitution. There is nothing more central to our security, right, than the strength and vitality of our institutions, and elections are one major piece of that. So there's no doubt that they're after it. Why are they after it? I think it's been well stated. It's cheap. We have lots of problems internally that they can exploit. As a matter of fact, a lot of what they do now is really build off of narratives that are already out there, left versus right, for instance, particular groups on particular issues. They're just building off of those divisions through social media exploitation and trying to ramp them up. In fact, in the 2016 election, there were instances that were unearthed of them bringing together, they amped up both sides of an issue and brought them together physically in one location in hopes of starting a brawl. So the outcome, more than anything, is to devalue our system and bring chaos, and we are not prepared for 2020. We have a limited amount of investment at the federal government level. States are in all different states of readiness. And I think there's much more we could do systematically, both to shore up the American public to start to have the media literacy and the civics knowledge, if you will, in the long term, to be stronger as a democracy. And then in the really near term, to have the tools of strategic narrative and counter disinformation, vest that appropriately in agents of the federal government, so for instance, Department of Homeland Security, and move out quickly. That is not where we are today.
So, Kath, what should the executive branch do? What should Congress do to work with the 50 states which control elections in the United States to raise our defenses? And why haven't we had a bigger national effort?
Yeah, and again, I think it's because we're in a strange state of suspended reality where very little is moving in general in terms of legislative priorities, of course. So this is one of those. And there is sort of an acceptance of the fact that there is this threat. But of course, it's been highly politicized in the US system, right? So going after issues of election interference seems to mean indicating that the Russians delivered Trump an election or giving some kind of credence to a particular partisan viewpoint. So I think we've had a lot of difficulties separating this issue of foreign election interference from the political fights that we are having. And again, the Russians are helping that by exploiting it. I mentioned before other parties are involved. That may be part of the solution to help galvanize action. The Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians, and they will have different interests and they'll be going in different directions. I think that's something that you can get more energy around than we had in investigating, if you will, in 2016. So some of the things that can happen, I mentioned DHS has an election security task force. I think Congress should be authorizing and appropriating to that task force to have grant making that's, first of all, the resources to sustain professional staff and execute the mission across 50 states, and then to have a grant making process that delivers the kinds of capabilities that are most important to the states. So those could be conditional grants that are targeted at specific cyber protection approaches. I think it also requires, of course, a narrative shift. That's not going to happen, I think, with the president. So the question is, are there other major speakers, whether leaders inside government, whether in the legislative branch and or in the executive branch, who are going to start talking to the American people about disinformation as a real threat?
But the Senate Majority Leader just blocked legislation on improving election security.
Senator McConnell. Yeah.
These are difficult times. But that's what it takes. I think you have to have a conversation with the American people about how to understand when they're being fed lies, how to create trusted sources of information, and that requires a trust in those sources, whether that's government or media. And that's a longer-term solution than I think we're going to get by 2020. So I think what we need to do by 2020 is really try to invest those dollars in the cyber defense side of it, which I think is more tractable, if you will, in terms of it being a technical issue rather than a political issue. And I think those who are able to speak in as bipartisan or nonpartisan a way as can be heard, they need to be speaking up now about the importance of this issue.
You spent your whole life thinking about how to defend the United States from a country like Russia. Earlier, it was the arms, strategic and tactical arms. Now it's the soft underbelly of our cyber system. Is this the more immediate threat right now than the nuclear weapons? Of course, they're both important, but where would you put your attention first?
Well, I think, I put it this way. On the nuclear weapons side, we have a way of thinking through that. We have expertise, we have capability extant. We have a nuclear triad, for instance. And so I think we can spend less relative leadership energy making sure we're keeping that sustained, important as it is. And I do think we have important gaps on conventional forces, which I'm not here to talk about today. That's a whole other topic, but I don't want to let that go by. This is absolutely the smartest, cheapest way to go at the United States right now. And we should
go at us.
Yeah, we should be just as smart as an adversary. You build off your strengths, you limit your vulnerabilities. We're not doing either right now. Our strengths are alliances, leveraging an innovative private sector, and our democracy. And all three of those we are not fully leveraging, and in fact, we are taking, in some cases, actions that diminish those advantages, even as we're not really shoring up those vulnerabilities. So, for instance, on cyber.
Thank you.
I think you should think of it as a two-step process. I mean, for example, giving 9 million euros to Marine Le Pen which they did.
Putin. Yeah.
I mean, and Marine Le Pen's position was to pull France out of NATO. Now, if you can sort of use the Rumsfeldian disaggregate Europe or disaggregate NATO, then all of the military options become really worrisome. As long as you can keep these entities alive and functioning, well, then we can rest easy. But you see, the effort is everywhere promoting anti-EU forces, everywhere promoting anti-NATO forces, and doing it not only through social media, but also through bribes and money. And we just saw, Salvini in Italy these embarrassing tapes, and we'll see what happens with it. I mean, all of this, they are focused on supporting anti-EU, anti-NATO forces in every country of those organizations.
Thank you. John, you have spent your professional life as an intelligence analyst, intelligence officer, thinking about the rival, trying to get into the head, the mindset of the rival. If you would just give us a sense of what you think Putin is trying to do vis-a-vis us. Kath has given us a very palpable sense of what he's trying to do, concrete sense. Could you explain that? Assess Russia's power. I think Joe is right that over time, the next several decades, Russia will decline, but right now, pretty considerable power. And third, I'm going to add to the difficulty, why is President Trump so obsessed with his personal relationship with Putin, and why is he not? He seems to be closer to Putin than he is to Merkel, which is an upside-down American way of looking at the world.
Wow, those are tough questions. Let me start this way by saying that I was walking down the street in Moscow about 6 months ago with a veteran Foreign Service officer, someone known to the State Department people here. And he turned to me and said, we say this is a declining power. We say it has an economy about the size of Portugal, but they keep showing up. And what he meant was exactly that. They are a factor. They are always here. They are always a country we have to take cognizance of. I'll work toward your question, but thinking also that we have to figure out how we want to think about Russia, and we have to communicate with them. When I was there 6 months ago, I came away with the sense that our official communication with Russia has never been lower. Our ambassador did not have good access. We are PNGing, that is sending home their people and they're sending home ours. And I recall a day when you and I were working on this, Nick and Victoria, when there was a robust interchange, particularly about the things you strongly differed on. Right. So if you're not communicating with them, you're both sort of operating in the dark. Yeah. That's the first thought. The second thought is people go around saying this is a new Cold War. I think that's a very misleading metaphor. Why? Well, we're kind of nostalgic about the Cold War. It was so clear. But also, the Cold War had an imaginable end. It was a global struggle between two powers, and one of them went away. And we won, definitively. Russia isn't going away. So it's going to be here. It's going to be a factor. We're going to have to deal with it. What's he trying to do with us? I think Putin has 4 major objectives, and we're among them. First, he wants iron control at home, unchallenged control at home. When I was there last time, I spoke with a prominent businessman who spent his last 25 years in Russia, not an American, but from an allied country. And he said to me, you know what the social contract is here? Stay out of politics and you can have a good life. Because I was remarking that as I walked around Russia in particular, and you would see the same thing in some of the other major cities, it looks good. Cafes are full, even the bookshops are full. But stay out of politics and you can have a nice life here. Second objective is to exert influence, strong influence in the countries that once were part of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't think he's trying to remake the Soviet Union. You know, people go around quoting him as having said the greatest tragedy in human history was the breakup of the Soviet Union. There's a lesser-known Putin quote, which I almost never hear, which is, "Those who do not miss the Soviet Union have no heart. Those who miss it have no brain." So, you know, I think he's a realist. I don't think he wants to recreate that, but he certainly wants to have iron control, or not, he wants to have influence in the areas around him. Third, he wants to weaken our relationships with our allies, not just our NATO allies, but our EU allies and bilateral allies. And fourth, he wants to restore Russia's influence in other parts of the world. I would say from roughly 2012, when he became president again, Putin went global. Up till then, his mischief was mostly in the area around Russia, what we call the near abroad. Now, Syria is the leading, most visible example, but Russia is also active in Africa, Middle East. A little harder in Asia, although closely working with China. That's a whole other subject that we need to think about. So with us, the way I think about it is, imagine a dinner party, and we're at the adult table. He's over at the children's table. He wants to saw the legs off our table. And one way to do that is to diminish our democracy. Another way to do that is to drive wedges between us and our allies and to weaken our alliances. Because in the world we're going into, where we're dealing with peer competitors and a truly rising power in China, the force multiplier for us will be our alliances. We won't be able to spend our way to superiority as we have sometimes in the past. So our alliances are critical here, and he wants to weaken them. And I think his objectives are relatively clear. Now, what motivates him? What motivates Russia? Well, you know, Churchill couldn't figure it out. You know, his famous remark about a riddle inside a mystery, inside an enigma. So those are people who've worked on Russia, I think, particularly Tori, I don't know whether you would agree, but spent your good part of your life on Russia. It's really hard to figure out at the core, what is it that drives them? I think right now it's two things. Insecurity and a desire to broaden, make Russia great again, for lack of a better way to put it. Why the insecurity? Well, Russians will say they never felt more secure than during the Cold War, because they had two buffers around them. They had the East European satellites, and they had the inner buffer of the other republics of the Soviet Union. Now, it's not criticizing our policy, because I agree with what Nick said about the benefits of enlarging NATO, but now they don't have those buffers. They don't have the satellites, and they don't have the republics that once were part of the Soviet Union. And when you say to them, why are you interfering with NATO, their line back to you is, why did you put NATO on our border? Well, we understand that we didn't put it on their border to threaten them, but I think we need to understand also they do feel insecure. And when countries are insecure, they do strange and dangerous things. So again, I go back to maybe my first point. It's important that we neither demonize Russia nor cut it off. We need to understand it, we need to communicate with it, and we're not going to make it go away. Our strategy, I think, should be to put limits on what it can do, to limit, and I'm going to stop now because I was about to launch into a discussion of intelligence, which is, that's a whole other subject. What is their intelligence effort? And Kath covered some of that, but in the intelligence realm, for example, it means we need a really robust counterintelligence effort. We have one, but it needs to be an area into which we put enormous resources to make sure that we understand. After all, the magnitude of their effort is signaled by the fact that we were able to send home 60 intelligence officers in March. That's a lot of intelligence officers. I mean, we are their #1 target.
We kicked them out.
We kicked them out. We PNG'd them, persona non grata. This was in response to particularly the poisoning of Skripal in the UK. along with many of our allies. But 60, that's a lot. So their effort against us on the intelligence side is roughly what it was during the Cold War. So we are the #1 target. So it's a complicated problem, and they are an adversary. And I think we need to deal with them smartly.
John, 30 seconds, because it's a very relevant issue, and I think it's confused Theresa May, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel. Why is the president unfailingly uncritical of Vladimir Putin and yet incessantly critical of the democratic leaders of NATO? It is happening. They're pulling away from us because of it. Why is he doing this?
Well, isn't that the $64,000 question?
Yeah.
And if I knew it, my name would probably be Robert Mueller. I don't know. It's,
Say more.
Nice.
well, I'm not sure that Bob Mueller really knows exactly the answer to that question. I think he was striving to figure it out. Anyone in here, any American could answer that question. We all see the same thing with the president. My hunch is he finds autocratic leaders simpatico. He admires the fact that they have this unchallenged control over so many aspects of their country. If this is a president who's talking about fake news and the media being the enemy of the people, well, that's not a problem Putin has. And it's clearly something that eats away at this president. So I think he looks at them with a certain amount of envy. Sad to say. That'd be my best guess. I can't sit here and tell you, because I used to work on intelligence, that he's an asset of the Russian intelligence service. No one knows that. I would not say that. I think that's almost too simplistic. I think he just admires that type of governance.
So before we go to questions, Toomas, Toria, Kath, if you were advising President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, in terms of rebalancing this relationship with Russia, being very tough where we must, but I think taking John's admonition, which two diplomats here would certainly believe in, don't we need a closer dialogue to avoid the kind of mistakes that Joe talked about on the first panel this afternoon and that John has talked about?
I would say that you have to be consistent. There's a better German word, konsequent, but that is just, stick to your policy, because I have a feeling that in the wake of the Skripal thing, he's just waiting us out. And you see one by one, they're going, okay, we did that, but maybe, it'd be nice to do something and to get started again.
Yeah.
This perennial push to maintain sanctions that were adopted after the annexation of Crimea and MH17. Yesterday was the 5-year anniversary of that horrible crime. It's, there's now this building pressure again. Let's bygones be bygones. And from his perspective, having already been there, as you said, for 20 years, it's like, I'm going to wait around another 2 years and then everything will go back to normal. We've seen it with the UK numerous times. We're still in the post-Skripal phase right now, but how long is that going to last? We had Litvinenko, a British subject, murdered on British territory, in London, yet, then it's eased up. So you get over the initial outrage, and then pretty soon things are moving, and then you see movement in a number of countries in Europe, even among East European countries, saying, it's not so bad, and maybe we can just sort of find a modus vivendi, and then you can do, so that's, I think, what he's waiting for, and I would say, just if you make a decision, stick to it.
Thank you. Toria?
Look, since 1948, the U.S. has led the Allied family in our comprehensive approach to first the Soviet Union and then Russia, and we are not doing that anymore. We have this whole panoply of issues, from defending democracy to arms control to their use of dirty money throughout our economic system, et cetera, that we ought to be addressing. But at the same time, we ought to be playing for a better Russia, as Ronald Reagan did, and he was constantly appealing over the heads of bad Soviet governments to the Russian people. And I actually think that at home, Putin's model is beginning to fail. The compact he has with his people, you stay out of politics and the chicken in your pot will get fatter every year, he can't deliver anymore because he hasn't made the investments in Russia itself. And when you look at polling in Russia, what do they care about most now? Not the glory of Ukraine or the glory of Syria or the glory of messing with our elections, but the fact that their hospitals don't work, that their roads are broken down, that you have to bribe your way to get into university, et cetera. So I actually think we've got, if we were to put ourselves together with allies and raise the cost to Putin for messing with both our democratic systems, for breaking global norms that he has previously agreed to, but also at the same time offer the Russian people a better deal. Come back into the family of European nations, and here are the economic benefits, here are the trade deals that we could conceivably do, here is the travel and this kind of thing. What has Putin given you? He's given you a false, empty glory. And try to get back to that kind of a conversation. In terms of having diplomatic dialogue, I agree with John that we used to have channels, rich channels at every level with every ministry of the Russian government, which would come together at the presidency. I remember when I was on the ground in Moscow and you were at the NSC, and we would talk about trying to get all the pieces together. When the president's not leading a comprehensive policy, that's very difficult to do. But on the Russian side, as Putin has, made his own vertical of power tighter and tighter, he doesn't trust anybody to negotiate anything. And so you can have these conversations. Our colleague Jim Jeffries having conversations every week with his buddy on Syria, but that doesn't mean that guy's allowed to make any decisions. So it's also a function of Putin's level of control, which is why talking right to Russians about a better deal needs to be part of the mix.
Thank you.
A small interjection, though. I mean, he was on a downhill road in 2014, and then he used Crimea to build up this huge jingoistic, Crimea's ours. And I guess one of the little things I worry about is doing a Crimea redux. Let's see if we can again get everyone to love me again because I've brought something back
to the glory of Russia.
But I'm not sure it works anymore in this.
Yeah, it may not.
Kath, last word before we go to questions.
Yeah, I was just going to add an and, because I agree with everything that's been said. I'll start the and with be a better model, be a stronger alternative, right?
Yes.
So that the Russians actually believe that they'd want to have a society like ours. So we have a lot of work to do here. But then you asked explicitly for areas to work together, and Tori has mentioned one very clear one, which is New START. Strategic arms control, arms talks have been a very strong, positive place for Americans and Russians to move the relationship in positive directions. I think we should be engaged in that. There are some other spaces, Syria, but not so much political resolution of Syria, but deconfliction, military deconfliction in Syria, I think is one that is making some progress, or is at least at a level that you can expect certain advantages from that conversation that protects lives. That's no small thing. I think civil space is another. And then I think probably on the more questionable side, but maybe worth a try, is on the Arctic.
Yeah. I would just suggest as we go to questions, we're fighting a battle of ideas with Russia and China. They are very and maybe MBS and Erdogan. They're all basically saying the authoritarian model is a superior model to our model. And think of the big moments of the Cold War, really nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It was Kennedy at the Berlin Wall in 1963, Reagan at the same wall, different part of the wall in 87, asserting our model, what we believe. And that's something that we can control.
Yep.
But we don't have, the president's not prepared to do that. His successors should. Questions, comments for this fantastic group? John Scarlett of the United Kingdom, who knows a little bit about Russia. John.
Well, if I could, a comment and then a basic question. Obviously, taking account of our recent experience, because we've been on the front line somewhat in this area. You haven't quite mentioned, when you're talking about the motivation and mindset for Vladimir Putin, that he lived through personally, very directly, the humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And that people of that generation don't forget it. So it's just there. And of course it creates a sense of insecurity and resentment.
And John, just so people here know what you know, Putin was an intelligence officer in East Germany, had to burn the files and basically close down shop as
Well, he was an officer, he was lieutenant colonel briefly, I think, but he was lieutenant colonel in the Leningrad KGB in Dresden. That's right, which was not a top career job in the old KGB. He wasn't even in the federal KGB at the center. So there's a tendency to exaggerate his KGB experience, because all Soviet officials thought a bit like that in those days. So still, so the humiliation sense of it isn't just a KGB sense. It's I would say, somebody from that generation who was a loyal Soviet official. But so we have to understand that. Now, it seems to me we haven't quite answered the difficult question that we have before us, because, comments have been made, which many people like me very strongly support, that it's dangerous not to have good contact and good dialogue and effective dialogue and channels and so on with a regime of that kind. But how do you do that when it behaves in the way it does, and it carries on behaving in the way it does? Obviously, the particular issue of Skripal most recently, it's not true, by the way, that nothing much happened after Litvinenko. A lot, yes, it did. In fact, we broke off effective relations with them in a whole number of areas, and we haven't restored them. So we need to be clear about that. So, but all the same, we haven't quite sort of worked out how do we manage that balance between, on the one hand, responding to the vicious behavior, which was completely outrageous, obviously, around Skripal, at the same time finding ways of talking to each other.
So let me do this. Since we want to get a lot of questions, I may want to just ask John and Toria to take this one, because you both had to deal with this question. How do we compete and yet communicate so that we don't get into a situation that's dangerous?
Well, Sir John puts his finger on an important point, and I agree with what Toria said about the difficulty of dialogue. Going back to this trip I mentioned, we spoke with people who work on arms control, professional people in the Russian ministries. And they were not getting any encouragement from Putin. They were quite depressed about it, to reignite an arms control dialogue. So what Toria said about the difficulty of having a dialogue is true. That said, I still think it's worth talking to them, but with this caveat. In my personal experience, it's very important to be candid and direct with the Russians.
Yep.
Very important to be candid and direct, including when you know they are lying to you. I recall sitting in in a building, and actually in Moscow, and in a consultation in which, for a variety of reasons, I knew they were just telling me flat-out lies. You can't tell them how you know, but you have to challenge them and say, we know that's not correct. We know that is wrong. We know that for certain. Now, will they admit they're wrong? Will they admit that? No. But it's important that they know you know, because that changes the dialogue a little bit. It starts to get it on some plane where you're not quite communicating, but you're getting closer that way. And that's one thought I have about it. That's not perfect, but it's better than nothing.
In the old days, they actually would very rarely lie to your face because they didn't want to lose credibility. They might not fully disclose X or Y, but nowadays the diplomatic lying is another form of disinformation. So you have to go into it very, very well informed. But you still have this problem of whether the interlocutor below the level of Putin has any power. I did 6 rounds with his appointed presidential administration guy on Ukraine in 2015 and 16. And to the extent we made progress, it was only because Papa Putin was watching on a daily basis. But it was limited, let's put it that way. Look, I think going back to the point of wrapping ourselves in our allied family, we have to be very clear that we will raise the costs regularly and painfully on bad behavior, and on things that are dangerous to our way of life and our security and our economy and our democracy if they continue. But there will also be benefits in the form of sanctions coming off, markets opening, better relationship with us, coming back into the European family and benefiting from prosperity, and spending less money on weapons if they're willing to cut deals. I think we've made a mistake getting too stovepiped, Syria for Syria, arms control for arms control, money for money. We need to put it all in a single package. And I also think that we're not doing as well, including on the intelligence side, of looking at the full range of tools that we have, particularly the economic tools. I mean, why, after Skripal and after continued election interference in 2018, all across the transatlantic space, Europe and the United States, can Russia still float its sovereign bonds in the European market? I mean, that is absurd. So we have tools like that. We have tools in terms of exposing how Putin rips off his own citizens and pockets the money and hides it in our banks that we could be pushing back into Russia. So we're just, we need to pull the family together. We need to make cost benefit very clear. And we need to be, as you said, Nick, very, very strong in the benefits of our way of living, including for Russian people, versus what he's offering.
Yeah. Thank you, Toria. Let's take two questions together. First is here, and the second is Ambassador Stu Bernstein here.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Neumann. I'm the ambassador for Juan Guaido, the Venezuelan, to the UK. In the list of threats, Russia is, of course, crushing us. Is literally causing the biggest humanitarian crisis the Western Hemisphere has ever seen, and using my country as his personal little crime center. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts of this panel on how to counter Russia in Latin America, in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and the threats that poses to U.S. interests. And as you may recall, prior to this, we were great allies of the United States.
Thank you. We'll take that question. And Stu, why don't you ask your question now?
You touched on it a minute. Fabulous panel. Putin, we know, is the richest man in the world, and all the oligarchs are has all his money here in America. How will that play into how he reacts with us?
Who would like to take Venezuela? Let's just limit it to Venezuela rather than expand it to Cuba, which is a can of worms. Russian involvement in Venezuela, which appears, John.
Well, they are exploiting Venezuela, as the ambassador knows, at first offering assistance, but in return for oil concessions and other things, basically sucking everything out they can. The only way to answer your question is with U.S. leadership in terms of engaging the rest of Latin America to oppose what is going on in Venezuela and to assist Venezuela with its humanitarian issues and to basically enforce a doctrine that we once called the Monroe Doctrine and try and chase Putin out of the hemisphere. I think the problem is it's not going to go to a military confrontation. Our conventional power, our nuclear power, does not come much into play here. So it comes down really to diplomacy and to sanctions and such. And those instruments are there. And more broadly, one of the things we really haven't talked about here, but more broadly, and I would embed Venezuela in this, our combating Russian influence and efforts depends on the strength of our leadership in the world. That is, if we are not leading, and that's a whole separate conversation, but present, diplomatically robust, and pushing everywhere, engaging, and we're not right now, things like this happen. And as I said, Putin went global roughly in 2012, and Venezuela, I'm sorry to say, is one of the victims.
Can I just a tactical asterisk on this one without solving the Venezuela problem? I think we could do a lot more to educate the Venezuelan people on how the Russian relationship is ripping them off, that this is not something that Moscow's doing for the generosity of spirit, that it is all about sucking Venezuela dry and oil and all of these kinds of things, and we don't get that word out strongly enough.
Toomas and Kath, Ambassador Bernstein's question on the oligarchy.
I'll give you a simple solution that should be followed not only by the United States, but also by a number of our allies that don't do this either, which is eliminate the possibility of buying property through anonymous shell companies.
Yes.
I mean, we know the case of the man who led the Duma action on forbidding adoption, began with a K, I forget his name, at the time owned a $2.9 million condo in Miami. We know that the consigliere of Semyon Mogilevich, the godfather of Russia, I mean the mafiosi, his consigliere bought apartments in Trump Tower. This is only possible through allowing anonymous shell companies to buy property. Now, we were paranoid in my country. We don't allow a shell company. We have to know who's on the board. Well, we were paranoid because we're right next to the country. So we undertook certain actions that I think that everyone needs to take, and the UK needs to take, and probably France needs to take, because that is what enables them to live the way they are. It's not simply money laundering, or it's indirect money laundering because they have illicit money, but with which they buy property, and no one knows who's the real owner, and then you find out that, well, there's this person living there. And I would say that would be one simple solution, that would really sort of dampen down all of this.
Thank you. Kath.
Yeah, I just would play further on the overall point on transparency. Anya Manuel mentioned it this morning in the panel in the context of China, and in general for authoritarians, transparency is kryptonite. And I think this is a great example. It's not the only one. I think to the extent that you can reveal, make clear, this, by the way, affects American oligarchs as well, where money is going, what its source is, whether it's in social media, or whether it's in investments in real estate, or whatever it is. I think that will help very much democratic societies strengthen themselves, make themselves less vulnerable to accusations of being on the same playing field with autocracies, and it hurts them. I want to mention one other thing, just because it hasn't really come up. We have a lot of inducement tools we are not tapping. It sort of touches on John mentioning before some of the work done during the Cold War. Yes, we can get better at economic transparency regulation and coercion, and filling out our toolkit beyond the military piece that we love to use so much. But we also have a huge advantage in terms of being able to tap into inducements. Information sharing is an inducement. Building alliances and partnerships through security cooperation is an inducement. But then there's like real money inducements with the private sector, getting them into innovation, let's say on election security, let's say in R&D areas that are important to national security, and with those abroad, so that we're creating the field we want to play on, not playing on their field.
Thank you very much. I'm a baseball fan. We're going to go into extra innings. We're going to take one more question right over here. Right over here. At the very edge of the room. The woman with her hand up. Yeah. And then we'll take a break after this question and answer. We'll come back in 10 minutes for Secretary of State Albright.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Glass from Al Jazeera. I'm wondering how much of this we've brought on ourselves by allowing Russia to take Crimea with what seemed like minimal sanctions. He used it to pioneer his hybrid warfare. He didn't just bring his own special forces in. There were also these militias that were there acting as private citizens. There were actually basically people straight out of central casting on the streets of Sevastopol and Simferopol saying that they were all for this. And now he's done the same thing in Syria. And now they're actually publicly talking, his generals are publicly talking about this doctrine. How much have we learned from that? How much, can we prevent it? And Victoria, to your point about talking directly to the Russian people, I mean, even in Crimea in 2014, the Russians were hearing something totally different than what the rest of the world were hearing because they controlled all of the media outlets.
Thank you. It is important to remember the United States did not have in 2014, does not have in 2019, a security obligation to defend Ukraine, its people or territory. It's never existed. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. Victoria was there. There and in the aftermath. Why don't you take this one? There is no security. No, there were security assurances given to Ukraine on December 7th, 1995, but they do not amount to a NATO-like protection in the case of military attack. The Ukrainians knew that when they signed that 1995 document with President Clinton. Tori and I think were in the room for that signing. Please.
Point on
Yeah.
this too.
Look, we could have a whole nother panel, and we should someday. I think we did last year, maybe. Crimea was very difficult because it went very, very quickly, and it would have been very hard for anybody to defend or push back, and frankly, no Western government was standing up and saying, I'm going to win back Severopol. I do think that when they moved on Donbass, it was a slower roll, and we were not quick enough either to raise the costs or to get more military support into the Ukrainian people. There were a lot of reasons for that too. I still think that we've allowed Putin to just sit on that because the terms of stalling haven't cost him very much. So, that said, the best thing we can do for the people of Ukraine is support the strength and independence and clean governance and prosperity of the other 93% of Ukraine, which, by the way, if they succeed, will set a very complicated example for Putin's Russia, which doesn't have the same liberties or the same opportunities because of the way Putin has governed.
However, I don't think it's been sufficiently impressed upon sort of the nuclear powers that the violation of an agreement that got rid of the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, in return a guarantee that of maintaining the territorial integrity, renders the NPT dead, and I don't see how a North Korea or whoever decides to now develop nuclear weapons would ever accept a deal like that, because they go, what do you mean? Ukraine got rid of their nuclear weapons. Their territorial integrity is gone. And I think that's the broader implication, and this will last for decades.
We have to take what we can for the future out of this, would be the way I'd answer it.
Absolutely.
You can't look backward. Looking to the future, the big lesson out of Ukraine is that we are going to go into the gray zone now. And Kath I recommend you all look at the CSIS website at some point. She's just published
I'll pay you now.
Okay. She's just published a really impressive study on how to think about gray zone warfare, which is not what we're used to. Big important powers like us don't like to do sneaky stuff like that. My old agency, of course, is an exception. But big important powers, we have strong conventional power, nuclear power. That's not the card he's playing. And we have, in fact, I had the lesson of this read to me by one of our counterpart in Latvia, of all places, who said to me, the lesson out of Crimea is we must not allow a situation of ambiguity to develop, which is what happened. Because for a long time we were saying, what's going on there? It became apparent, but that's the big lesson, I think.
So we'll be back in this room in 10 minutes to hear Secretary Albright, but please join me in thanking Toomas Ilves, Toria Nuland, Kath Hicks, John McLaughlin. Great job.